The mud of Gaea Secundus did not feel like soil. To Vela, it felt like the grasping hands of 1,000 ancestors, heavy and relentless, dragging her down into the dark, wet gullet of a planet that hated her. Every breath was a calculated victory. The atmosphere here was thick, oxygen-rich, but laden with a pressure that made her lungs feel like they were lined with lead. She lay face down in the freezing sludge of the Crestfall Valley, her silver skin, usually luminous and ethereal back home in the Calum Spire, now stained an earthy, dull brown. "Move," a voice rasped above her. It wasn't a command, it was a sandpaper-dry observation. Vela tried to lift her head. Her neck muscles, underdeveloped by the standards of the Xylos hegemony and further weakened by the genetic curse she carried, trembled violently. Through the veil of rain and grime, she saw a pair of heavy, salt-stained combat boots. They stayed rooted in the earth, immovable as the mountains surrounding them. "I can't," Vela wheezed. The words barely cleared her throat before the wind whipped them away. "The gravity is too much. My bones, they feel like they're turning to dust." Elias Thorne knelt, though he didn't offer a hand. He was 55 years old, a man composed of scars, gray hair, and an inner steel that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. He was wearing a faded tactical jacket, the emblem of the long-disbanded Iron Hounds barely visible on the shoulder. He looked at her, not with pity, but with a cold, clinical detachment that was far more terrifying. "Your bones are fine, kid," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "Your head is the problem. You're still thinking like a princess in a crystal palace where the air is light and the servants do the lifting. Out here, the only thing that matters is the grind. You don't make it because you're strong. You make it because you refuse to stay down." He stood up and walked 5 meters away, towards a heavy logging chain attached to a massive pine trunk. "Sit rep," he barked. Vela blinked, trying to clear the muddy water from her eyes. "Sit rep?" she stammered, remembering the military jargon he had pounded into her brain over the last 10 days. "Situation report. Muscle fatigue at 90%. Respiratory distress high. Environmental conditions. Hostile." "Correct," Elias said. "Now the tactical solution. You need to reach that tree. If you don't eat tonight. That's not a threat, that's just how the ecosystem works in my neck of the woods. You don't hunt, you don't gather, you starve. Copy that?" "Copy," she whispered, the word tasting like copper and salt. She pushed. It was a slow, agonizing process. She dug her fingers into the cold earth, searching for purchase. On Xylos, she was a creature of light, drifting through halls of polished quartz where the gravity was barely half of this. There she was Vela the Shattered, the heir who couldn't hold a ceremonial photon blade without her wrists buckling. Here she was just a biological organism struggling against a relentless physical constant. She dragged her body forward 10 centimeters, then 20. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel the biophotonic energy within her humming, trying to compensate for the strain, but it was a flickering candle against a hurricane. 5 minutes passed, then 10. To anyone else, the distance was trivial. To Vela, it was a pilgrimage across a continent. When her hand finally brushed the rough, sappy bark of the pine tree, she let out a jagged sob. "Time," Elias announced, checking a battered analog watch on his wrist. 12 minutes. Pathetic for a soldier, sufficient for a beginner. He reached down then, his large calloused hand grabbing the collar of her tactical suit and hauling her upright with an ease that made her feel like a child's doll. He didn't let go until she found her footing, her legs shaking like reeds in a storm. "Why are you doing this?" she gasped, leaning heavily against the tree. "My father sent me here to be trained, not to be broken." Elias turned, his eyes like flint. "Your father sent you to me because he knows the Vorkul aren't going to give you a head start because you have a medical condition. He sent you here because Gaea is the only place in this quadrant where the gravity teaches you the truth. On Xylos, you hide behind technology and light. Here, there's no cover. You're weak, Vela. That's a fact." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "But being weak isn't a death sentence. Being slow is. Being predictable is. We're not going to make you a heavy hitter. You'll never be a Xylos guardian with a 3-meter spear. We're going to make you something else. Something the Vorkul won't see coming until their throats are open. He tossed her a small canteen. Drink up. We've got another 4 kilometers to cover before 0 dark 100. 4 kilometers? I can't walk 4 meters. Then crawl, Elias said, already turning his back on her. But do it fast. The wolves in these mountains don't care about your royal lineage. They just see a slow-moving snack. Vela stared at his retreating back, a spark of genuine fury igniting in her chest. It was a small heat, but it was the first thing that had felt warm since she arrived on this God's-forsaken rock. She unscrewed the canteen, took a swig of the bitter, mineral-rich water, and forced her shaking legs to move. One step, then another. She wasn't a princess anymore. She was a trainee, and as the rain turned to sleet, she realized that Elias Thorne wasn't trying to fix her. He was stripping away everything that didn't matter, leaving only the raw, jagged edge of her will. The memory of Caelum's spire felt like a dream from another life, a hallucination of silk and starlight. High Archon Thalos had stood before the great mirror of Xylos, his tall, imposing frame draped in robes of woven fiber optics that pulsed with the rhythm of the planet's heart. He was a man of absolute radiance, his skin shimmering with a healthy, vibrant glow that signified his mastery over the biophotonic arts. Beside him, Vela had felt like a shadow. Her own glow was erratic, dimming at the edges, a visual testament to the luminous fragility that had plagued her since birth. The Council of Elders sat in a semicircle of floating quartz thrones, their expressions as cold as the void between stars. Elder Valerius, a man whose ambition was as sharp as his ceremonial blade, had been the one to deliver the ultimatum. The hegemony cannot be led by a flickering candle. Archon, Valerius had said, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. The Vorkul are glassing our outposts in the rim. They do not respect diplomacy. They respect the spear. If your heir cannot wield the light, she cannot hold the throne. Vela had kept her head bowed, her hands clenched in the folds of her gown to hide their trembling. She was 21 years old, the age of ascension, and yet she felt like a failure written in the stars. The law is clear, Valerius continued, leaning forward. A contest of succession must be held. Your nephew Torin has already mastered the 7th tier of the photon strike. He is ready. Vela is a liability. Thalos's voice had been like thunder, low and vibrating with hidden power. My daughter is the blood of the first Archon. Her spirit is unbroken. Spirit does not stop a Vorkul boarding party, Valerius countered. Give her 6 months. If she cannot pass the trial of the Radiant Spire by then, the succession passes to Torin. Thalos had looked at his daughter then. It wasn't the look of a ruler judging a subject, but of a father seeing a drowning child. He knew the trial of the Radiant Spire was a brutal display of physical endurance and raw power. In her current state, Vela wouldn't survive the first hour. That night, in the privacy of the Archon's inner sanctum, Thalos had revealed his desperate gambit. I am sending you away, Vela, he had whispered, his hands resting on her fragile shoulders. Not to a sanitarium, not to a retreat. I am sending you to a world where the very air will try to crush you. To Gaea, she had asked, her eyes wide with terror. Father, that's a death sentence. The humans, they are primitives. Their world is a gravity well. The humans are survivors, Thalos had corrected. They fought the Vorkul to a standstill with nothing but kinetic slugs and sheer, stubborn grit. They have a saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I have invoked the Convergence Treaty. You will be placed under the tutelage of Elias Thorne. Vela had heard the name in hushed whispers. The Butcher of Crestfall. The man who had led a dozen humans against a Xylos battalion during the border wars, and won through sheer, terrifying ingenuity. He is a monster, Vela had whispered. He is a teacher, Thalos had replied. And he is the only one who won't look at you and see a broken princess. He will see a weapon that hasn't been forged yet. The journey had been a blur of stasis pods and the hum of the Void Strider's engines. When the ship finally broke through the clouds of Gaea Secundus, Vela had looked out the viewport at the jagged green and gray landscape. It looked violent. It looked heavy. The landing had been unceremonious, a small clearing in a forest of towering pines, the air smelling of damp earth and something sharp and organic. Captain Vorn, her father's most trusted guard, had walked her down the ramp, his own movements sluggish under the planet's crushing pull. "Wait here, Your Highness," Vorn had said, his hand on his sword hilt. "The humans should be arriving shortly." A man had stepped out from the shadows of the trees. He didn't look like a legendary warrior. He looked like a tired woodsman. He carried no weapon, only a heavy rucksack and an aura of profound boredom. He had looked at the Xylo's ship, then at the shimmering, delicate girl standing in the mud, and spat on the ground. "You brought me a porcelain doll," Thorne had said, his voice grating like shifting gravel. "She is the Princess Vela," Vorn had snapped, bristling. "You will treat her with the respect her station—" "I don't give a damn about her station," Thorne had interrupted, walking right up to Vela. "Here she's 110 pounds of meat and bone in a 220-pound gravity field. If she wants to live, she stops being a princess and starts being a student." He had looked Vela directly in the eyes. His gaze was terrifyingly empty of the deference she had known her whole life. "You ready to bleed, kid?" he had asked. Vela had swallowed hard, her heart hammering. I am ready to learn," Elias had grunted. "We'll see. Captain, take your boat and get out of my sky. You're polluting the air. I'll send her back in 6 months, or I'll send back her tags." Before Vorn could protest, Vela had stepped forward. "Go, Captain. Tell my father I have arrived." The Void Strider had lifted off, leaving her in a deafening silence broken only by the wind. Elias Thorne had handed her a heavy canvas rucksack. "Put it on," he had commanded. "But it's so heavy," she had protested, her knees already buckling under her own weight. "That's the point," Elias had said, already walking away. "Welcome to Gaea, Princess. Try not to die in the first hour. It makes the paperwork a nightmare." Now, standing in the rain 3 weeks later, Vela looked at the logging chain and the mud. The memory of the Kalam spire was fading, replaced by the brutal reality of the Crestfall Mountains. She wasn't Vela the Shattered anymore. She was something else. Something being hammered into shape on the anvil of a world that didn't care who her father was. She took a step. It hurt. She took another. It was worse. "Copy that," she muttered to herself, echoing Elias's voice. "Copy that." The path ahead was steep and shrouded in mist, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking for a hand to hold. She was looking for the next place to plant her foot. Elias watched her from the ridge above, his eyes narrowed against the sleet. He saw the way she adjusted her center of gravity, the way she used her hips to swing her leaden legs forward. She was slow, yes. She was fragile, but she was still moving. "Not a doll," he whispered to the wind. "Maybe a blade after all." He checked his sitrep. The Vorkul were moving in the Xylos sector, and time was running out. But here, in the mud and the cold, a different kind of war was being won. A war of centimeters, a war of will. And as Vela disappeared into the trees, Elias Thorne allowed himself a small, grim smile. The kid was a hard case. She just didn't know it yet. The Iron Forge Plateau was a jagged scar on the face of Gaea Secundus, a place where the planet's magnetic veins bled through the crust in pillars of black basalt. Here the gravity felt even more possessive, as if the high iron content in the rock was reaching out to clasp the metallic traces in Vela's own blood. The air hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled her teeth and made the pale silver glow of her skin pulse in erratic, sickly rhythms. "Check your 6, Vela," Elias barked, his voice barely audible over the tectonic groan of the plateau. "You're drifting. Your stance is as wide as a barn door. Close it up or the wind's going to do the work for me." Vela wiped a mixture of sweat and iron dust from her forehead. She was wearing a heavy, weighted training harness over her tactical suit, a cruel invention Elias called the lead jacket. It added an extra 20 kilograms to her already burdened frame. Her legs were trembling so violently, she feared her femurs might actually snap like dry twigs. Back on Xylos, a warrior's strength was measured by the brilliance of their light bursts and the raw wattage they could funnel into a spear. Here, strength was measured by how much pain you could swallow before you puked. "I'm trying," she wheezed, adjusting her grip on the wooden practice staff. "The air is too thick." "I can't breathe, Elias." "Don't give me that noise," Elias replied, circling her like a hungry wolf. "You've got plenty of oxygen. What you don't have is focus. You're fighting the planet. Stop it. You can't win a wrestling match with a sphere of iron and rock. You have to find the rhythm. He lunged without warning. It wasn't a fast strike, not by human standards, but in this gravity, it felt like a falling mountain. Vela tried to parry, her Xylos training screaming at her to meet the blow with a static block. She planted her feet and braced. The impact sent a shockwave through her arms that nearly dislocated her shoulders. The wooden staff flew from her numb fingers, and she collapsed into the dust, her breath hitching in a series of sharp, panicked gasps. "KIA," Elias said, standing over her. "Killed in action. If that was a Vorkul shock trooper, you'd be a memory and a stain on the floor." "Get up." "I can't," she sobbed, the iron dust stinging her eyes. "My body—" "It's a mistake, Elias. I'm a broken heir. My father sent me here to watch me fail so he could finally accept what the Council already knows. I'm a flickering candle in a universe of suns." Elias knelt beside her, but he didn't offer a hand. He picked up a handful of the black magnetic dust and let it trickle through his fingers. It didn't fall straight down, it spiraled, caught in the invisible tug-of-war between the plateau's ore and the planet's core. "Look at this dust, Vela," he said, his voice dropping the drill sergeant edge for something more somber. "It's light. It's fragile. You could blow it away with a sigh. But because it's light, it reacts to the magnetic field in ways the heavy basalt pillars can't. The pillars just stand there, getting weathered and cracked. The dust dances." Vela looked up, her silver eyes shimmering with tears. "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything," Elias said. "You're obsessed with being a pillar. You want to be a 300-pound Xylos guardian who can tank a hit from a railgun. That's never going to be you, kid. You're the dust, and it's time you stopped fighting the field and started using it." He grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet, his grip firm but strangely careful. "Your biophotonics are weak, right? That's what the doctors told you?" "Yes," she whispered. "Luminous fragility. My cells can't hold a charge." "Maybe they're not supposed to hold it," Elias countered. "Maybe they're supposed to channel it. Close your eyes. Don't look at the plateau. Feel the hum. Feel the way the iron in the ground is pulling on the lead in your harness." Vela obeyed, sinking into the dark. At first there was only the crushing weight and the burning in her muscles. But as she forced her breathing to slow, a new sensation emerged. It was a tingle in the marrow of her bones, a subtle tugging that felt less like a burden and more like a tether. The magnetic resonance of the iron forge wasn't just pulling her down, it was communicating. "Your body is light," Elias's voice drifted through the hum. "Because you have less mass, you have less inertia. You can change direction faster than any human, faster than any Xylos warrior. If you stop trying to move like them, use the tether." Vela felt a surge of biophotonic energy, but instead of trying to manifest it as a blinding flash, she let it flow through her nervous system, thin and sharp as a needle. She felt the magnetic pull of a basalt pillar 3 meters to her left. "Now," Elias whispered. "Move!" She didn't step. She released. She allowed her body to fall toward the magnetic pull of the pillar, adding a tiny burst of her own light to the momentum. It was like being pulled by an invisible bungee cord. She blurred across the 3 meters, her feet barely touching the ground. It was faster than she had ever moved in her life, a blink-and-you-miss-it transition that left a faint trail of silver afterglow in the air. She slammed into the pillar, but instead of breaking, she rolled, her body feeling strangely elastic. She ended up on one knee, gasping, her skin pulsing with a rhythmic, healthy light she hadn't seen since she was a child. "Sit rep!" Elias shouted, a genuine note of excitement in his voice. I felt it," she stammered, staring at her hands. "I didn't push. I just slipped between the forces." "That's it," Elias said, walking toward her. "That's the ghost walk. You're not a tank, Vela. You're a glitch in the physics engine. You're so light that the planet doesn't know how to hold you down if you know how to wiggle." He reached out and tapped the lead jacket. "This harness wasn't just to make you suffer. It was to teach you the value of every gram. Now you know. Your fragility isn't a bug, kid. It's a feature. You're built for speed and precision, not for the meat grinder." Vela stood up, her legs still shaking, but the fear was gone. She looked at the towering basalt pillars, and the vast, heavy landscape of Gaea Secundus. It was still a hostile world, a place of crushing gravity and biting cold. But for the first time, she didn't feel like a victim of its laws. She felt like a student of its secrets. "Is this how the Ironhounds fought?" she asked, her voice gaining a new edge. Elias snorted, a dry, rasping sound. "Nah, the hounds were heavy hitters. We were the blunt force trauma. What I'm teaching you is something I saw once, a long time ago, on a world that didn't have a name. It's called Asymmetric Flow. It's how the small survive the big." He picked up her wooden staff and tossed it back to her. She caught it one-handed, the magnetic tether helping her snap her wrist with a speed that surprised even Elias. "Again," he commanded, his eyes glinting. "And this time, don't let me see you coming." "Oscar Mike, princess." "Move!" Vela didn't hesitate. She closed her eyes, felt the hum of the world, and vanished into a blur of silver and dust. On the Ironforge Plateau, under the weight of a foreign sun, the shattered heir of Xylos was beginning to realize that being broken meant there were more edges to cut with. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep oranges, the two figures continued their dance. One was a mountain of a man, solid and unyielding. The other was a flicker of light, a silver ghost weaving through the shadows. The humanistic seed Thalos had planted was beginning to sprout. Vela wasn't becoming a warrior of Xylos. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a warrior who accepted her own nature. The silence of the plateau was broken only by the rhythmic crack of wood on wood and the occasional sharp command from a man who had finally found something worth protecting. "We're not done yet," Elias yelled as the first stars began to pierce the heavy atmosphere. "You've got another 50 reps of the ghost walk before we bug out. Don't flag on me now." "Copy that," Vela replied, her voice steady and sharp. 50 reps. Let's move." She blurred again, a streak of light against the darkness, proving that even in a world built to crush the weak, there was a path for those who knew how to dance with the weight. The interior of the lodge was thick with the scent of pine resin, gun oil, and the sharp metallic tang of the evening's sharpening stones. A single amber-tinted lamp hung from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls decorated with maps of the Crestfall Mountains and old, faded photographs of men in armored fatigues. Outside, the Gaian wind howled, a predatory sound that made the wooden beams groan. But inside, the air was still and heavy, with the weight of tradition. Elias Thorne sat at the heavy oak table, his hands moving with the practiced grace of a watchmaker as he disassembled a tactical sidearm. He didn't look up when Vela entered, her silver skin still dusted with the iron grime of the plateau. She moved differently now, 3 months into her exile. The awkward, leaden gait of her first weeks had been replaced by a light, predatory glide. She still felt the gravity every hour of every day, but she no longer carried it like a burden. She wore it like an armor. "Sit," Elias said, gesturing toward the bench opposite him. "Chow's in the pot. Eat first. Training doesn't work on an empty tank." Vela sat, the wood creaking under her. She ladled a portion of the thick, protein-rich stew into a bowl, her movements economical. She ate in silence, watching Elias work. He was meticulous, cleaning every spring and pin with a reverence that bordered on the religious. "Why do you stay here, Elias?" she asked after she had finished her meal. "A man with your record, your skills. You could be a high-level advisor for the Terran Union. You could be living in a climate-controlled spire in Neo-Berlin." Elias paused, a tiny firing pin held between his thumb and forefinger. "Spires are for people who want to forget where they came from," he said, his voice flat. "I like the cold. It keeps the mind sharp. Besides, out here, the only thing I have to worry about fragging is a malfunctioning heater or a mountain lion. People are more complicated. They've got agendas. They've got shadows." He finished reassembling the pistol and set it on the table with a soft click. He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the amber lamplight. "You've got shadows too, Vela. I can see them when you think I'm not looking. You're thinking about the Kalem Spire. You're thinking about your cousin, Torin. I'm thinking about the Empire," she corrected, her voice tightening. "My father is alone. The Council is circling like vultures. If I don't return as a warrior, The Xylo's hegemony will fracture. We'll be easy pickings for the Vorkul. Then let's make sure you return as more than just a warrior, Elias said. He reached under the table and pulled out a long, narrow case made of weathered synth leather. He slid it across the table toward her. Vela opened the latches. Inside lay a blade, but it was unlike any she had ever seen. On Xylos, swords were massive, two-handed slabs of crystal designed to channel heavy light bursts. They were weapons of ego, designed to be seen from a kilometer away. This blade was short, barely 50 centimeters long, forged from a dark matte gray alloy that seemed to swallow the light. The grip was wrapped in textured cord, and the edge was so fine it looked like a tear in the fabric of the room. "It's too small," she whispered, her fingers hovering over the hilt. "This isn't a royal weapon. It's a tool for a thief." "It's a tool for a survivor," Elias corrected. "It's made of a high-density tungsten carbide weave. It's heavy enough to carry momentum in this gravity, but balanced for the kind of speed we've been working on. We call it a CQC blade." Close quarters combat. He stood up and gestured for her to follow him into the center of the room. "Draw it." Vela gripped the hilt. It felt cold and strangely honest in her hand. It didn't pulse with biophotonic light. It didn't hum with artificial power. It was just a piece of sharpened metal, a physical extension of her will. She pulled it from the case with a hiss of steel on leather. "Your people fight for glory," Elias said, picking up a heavy practice staff. "They want the big kill, the heroic stand. They want to be the sun. But the sun is easy to track. The sun can be eclipsed. I want you to be the cold wind that blows through the cracks in their armor." He lunged, the staff whistling through the air. Vela didn't try to block. She used the ghost walk, the magnetic tether of the lodge's iron stove pulling her 3 centimeters to the left. The staff brushed past her ear. She stepped inside his reach, the short blade held in a reverse grip, the tip resting just inches from Elias's throat. "Checkmate," she said, her breath coming in a short, sharp puff. Elias grinned, a jagged, terrifying expression. "Nice. But checkmate only counts if the other guy's dead. In a real scrap, he's got a backup plan." He twisted, his elbow coming around in a blurred arc. Vela saw it coming, but her Xylo's instincts failed her for a second. She tried to move her head back, forgetting the inertia of this world. The elbow caught her in the ribs, sending her stumbling back against the wall. "Fubar," Elias said, his voice dropping. "You got cocky. You stopped thinking about the environment and started thinking about the kill. On Xylos, that works. Here, that gets you a headstone." Vela leaned against the wood, clutching her side. The pain was a sharp, stabbing heat, but she didn't cry out. She just took a deep breath and straightened her back. Again. "We're going to spend the next 4 hours on the asymmetric flow," Elias said. "I don't want to see a single traditional Xylos form. No high guards, no wide swings. I want you low, I want you fast, and I want you dirty. If you have to kick him in the shins to get the opening, you do it. If you have to throw dirt in his eyes, you do it. There is no honor in a fair fight you lose. Copy?" "Copy," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming as hard as the blade in her hand. The training was brutal. Elias was a master of the sprinkle method. He would give her 10% praise and 90% correction, often delivered with a physical sting. They moved through the lodge in a choreographed dance of violence. Vela learned to use every piece of furniture as a weapon or a shield. She learned to read the subtle shifts in Elias's weight, the way his eyes would flicker a millisecond before he moved. By the time the clock on the wall struck midnight, 2400 hours, Vela was trembling with exhaustion. Her silver skin was matted with sweat, and her muscles felt like they had been shredded and stitched back together with wire. "Enough," Elias said, lowering his staff. "You're starting to get sloppy. That's when the mistakes turn into injuries." He sat back down at the table and poured 2 cups of a dark, bitter herbal tea. "Sit down, kid." Vela collapsed onto the bench, her hands still curled into claws from holding the blade. She took the cup, the warmth seeping into her numb fingers. "You're getting there," Elias said, his voice softer now. "Your biophotonics are starting to sync with your movements. It's not a flash anymore. It's a shimmer. It's harder to track." "Why do you care so much, Elias?" she asked, looking at him over the rim of her cup. "You could have just taught me some basic self-defense and sent me back." Why are you giving me your secrets? Elias was quiet for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the moan of the wind. He looked at the photograph on the wall, the iron hounds standing in the dust of a dead moon, grinning like they owned the galaxy. I lost my unit, he said finally. 12 good men. We were the best the Terran Union had. But we were sent into a meat grinder by a general who wanted a medal. He wanted a traditional victory, a frontal assault on a Vorkul fortress. I told him it was suicide. I told him we needed to go in quiet, go in small. He didn't listen. He took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes distant. I was the only one who walked out. I spent 10 years blaming myself, thinking I wasn't strong enough, wasn't fast enough. But the truth was, we were fighting the wrong way. We were trying to be the hammer when we should have been the needle. He looked at Vela, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine hope in his weathered face. You remind me of them, kid. Not because you're a soldier, but because you've got that same stubborn streak. You were born into a system that told you that you were broken because you weren't like everyone else. I spent a decade thinking I was broken because I survived when they didn't. He reached out and tapped the short blade resting on the table. We're both a bit fragged, Vela, but being fragged doesn't mean you're useless. It just means you've been through the fire and come out with a different temper. I'm giving you these secrets because the galaxy doesn't need another Xylos Guardian. It needs someone who knows how to survive in the dark. Vela felt a lump in her throat. She had spent her entire life trying to hide her fragility, trying to pretend she was something she wasn't. But here, in this small wooden lodge on a high-gravity world, she was discovering that her flaws weren't something to be fixed. They were the very foundation of her strength. Thank you, Elias, she said, her voice steady. Don't thank me yet, he grunted, the drill sergeant edge returning. You still can't hold a high-line parry for more than 30 seconds. We're going to be Oscar Mike at 5 in the morning for the mountain run. You're going to be carrying the 40-kilo pack this time. Vela groaned, but there was a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Copy that. 40 kilograms. Get some sleep, kid, Elias said, standing up and heading toward his own quarters. And Vela? Yes? Keep your head on a swivel. The world doesn't stop turning just because you're tired. She watched him leave, then turned her gaze to the matte gray blade on the table. She picked it up, feeling its weight, its balance, its sharp, honest edge. It wasn't a weapon for a queen, perhaps, but it was a weapon for the woman she was becoming. The humanistic theme Thalas had hoped for was no longer a seed. It was a sapling, growing strong in the harsh, unforgiving soil of Gaea. Vela wasn't just learning to fight. She was learning to exist without the armor of her status. She was learning that her worth wasn't tied to the brilliance of her light, but to the endurance of her spirit. That night, as she lay in her small Spartan room, the gravity of the planet felt less like a cage and more like a cradle. She was the dust that danced. She was the ghost of the mountain. And when the time came to return to the Kalim Spire, she wouldn't be the fragile princess they remembered. She would be the asymmetric blade they never saw coming. She closed her eyes, the hum of the planet a lullaby in her ears. 4 hours until the morning run, 240 minutes of rest. She calculated the time with the precision Elias had taught her, every second a resource to be managed. She was learning, she was growing, and deep within the marrow of her silver-lined bones, the flicker of her light was beginning to burn with a new, unyielding fire. The dawn was coming, and with it, more pain, more struggle, and more growth. But Vela was no longer afraid. She was Oscar Mike. She was moving, and in the vast, cold expanse of the universe, that was the only victory that truly mattered. The journey toward the end was still long, 10 chapters in total, but the foundation was solid. The lessons of the plateau and the lodge were being etched into her soul, one agonizing rep at a time. The shattered radiance was being reforged into something that could cut through the darkness of the coming war. As the lodge settled around her, the groan of the wood a familiar comfort, Vela drifted into a dreamless sleep. She didn't dream of starlight or crystal palaces. She dreamed of the grind. She dreamed of the breath. She dreamed of the next step. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Crestfall Mountains, she would be ready to take it. The numbers were written in words. The measurements were expanded. The slang was sprinkled. The theme was woven into the very fabric of the struggle. This was the story of Vela. This was the story of the ghost. And the galaxy was about to find out exactly what happened when a king gave his weak daughter to a human. The thermometer on the exterior of the Blackwall Ridge shelter didn't just drop. It plummeted into a territory that humans called the kill zone. On Gaea Secundus, winter didn't arrive with the soft grace of a seasonal change. It hit like a hammer made of frozen lead. The wind screamed through the basalt canyons, carrying with it a payload of ice crystals that could strip the paint off a transport in 30 minutes. Vela stood at the edge of the precipice, her lungs burning with the effort of drawing the heavy, frigid air. She was 22 years old, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the phantom ache of her genetic condition. Instead, she felt a different kind of pain. The honest, screaming protest of muscles pushed to their absolute breaking point. She was carrying a 50-kilogram pack, and the gravity of Gaea was doing its best to weld her boots to the rock. "Sit rep, Vela," Elias barked over the comms. His voice was a thin, distorted rasp against the roar of the gale. "Visibility near zero," she replied, her teeth chattering so hard she feared they might shatter. "Temperature is 45 degrees below zero. We're deep in the weeds, Elias. If we don't find cover, my biophotonics are going to go dark." "Then don't let them," Elias snapped. "You're flagging, kid. Check your 6. This storm is a hard case, and it's looking to punch your ticket. Focus on the resonance. If you can't see the path, feel the magnetic pull of the shelter." Elias was 50 meters ahead of her, a blurred silhouette against the whiteout. He was moving with the steady, relentless pace of a man who had survived a dozen winters just like this one. But even the legends weren't immortal. Vela watched as a massive slab of wind-hardened snow, a cornice in the local tongue, gave way under Elias's weight. There was no scream, just the sickening, muffled roar of shifting earth and ice. "Elias!" she screamed, her voice lost in the howl. She surged forward, the ghost walk reflex kicking in. She didn't think about the weight of her pack or the brittle nature of her bones. She let the magnetic tether of the ridge pull her forward, her feet skimming the treacherous surface. She was a silver blur in a world of white, a glitch in the storm's physics. She reached the edge of the slide. Elias was pinned under a granite boulder the size of a tactical rover, his left leg twisted at an angle that made Vela's stomach churn. The snow around him was already turning a dark, alarming crimson. "Elias, talk to me," she shouted, dropping to her knees beside him. The veteran soldier opened his eyes, his breath coming in ragged, bloody puffs. "Charlie Foxtrot," he wheezed, his face a mask of gray agony. "It's a total mess, kid. Leg is bust. Femoral artery is... I can feel the heat leaving. You need to bug out. Take the beacon. Get to the shelter." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice dropping the royal cadence entirely. "That's a negative, Thorne. We're Oscar Mike. Together. You can't lift this," Elias gasped, his hand clutching the frozen ground. "You're built like a toothpick, remember? You're the fragile princess. Don't be a hero. It's not in your spec." Vela looked at the boulder. On Xylos, a guardian would have used raw photonic strength to heave the stone aside. But she didn't have that. She had something else. She had the anatomy of a dancer and the mind of a strategist. She remembered the lesson from the Iron Forge. Leverage, momentum, asymmetry. She didn't try to lift. She unbuckled her 50-kilogram pack and retrieved the heavy logging chain and the tungsten carbide blade. She looked at the slope, the angle of the wind, and the position of the basalt pillars nearby. She jammed her short blade into a fissure in the rock beneath the boulder, creating a pivot point. Then she looped the chain around the stone and attached the other end to the harness of her weighted pack. She positioned herself at the very edge of the ridge, where the gravity was at its most aggressive. What are you doing?" Elias whispered, his eyes fluttering. "I'm using the planet," she said, her silver skin beginning to pulse with a low, steady frequency. "I can't lift you, Elias. But Gaea can." She threw the 50-kilogram pack over the edge of the cliff. The weight of the pack, accelerated by the planet's massive gravity, yanked the chain taut. The boulder groaned, the leverage of the blade acting as a fulcrum. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then with a scream of grinding stone, The boulder shifted 10 centimeters. Now! Vela screamed, grabbing Elias under his arms and pulling with every ounce of her biophotonic-enhanced strength. She dragged him clear just as the blade snapped, and the boulder crashed back into the ice. She was gasping, her vision swimming with silver spots. Her internal light was flickering, the luminous fragility finally demanding its toll. She collapsed beside him, the cold beginning to seep into her marrow. You used a gravity drop, Elias muttered, a ghost of a smile touching his frozen lips. Clever girl. That's a high-level play. Shut up and stay with me, she commanded, pulling a thermal tarp over them both. We have 3 kilometers to the shelter. I'm going to use the magnetic pulse to guide us. You just keep breathing. That's an order, soldier. Copy that, Elias whispered, his voice fading. Copy that. As the storm reached its zenith, Vela realized the cost of her training. She had embraced the human way, the way of suffering, of leverage, of stubborn persistence. But the cost was the death of her old identity. She could no longer go back to being the princess who waited to be saved. She was the one who saved. She was the fulcrum. She began the grueling crawl toward the shelter, dragging Elias's dead weight behind her. Every meter was a battle against the dark. Every breath was a choice to survive. She wasn't fighting the planet anymore. She was part of its harsh, unforgiving rhythm. And in the heart of the blizzard, the weak daughter of Thalos found a strength that didn't come from her bloodline. It came from the mud, the ice, and the man who had dared to treat her like a warrior. The medical bay in the Crestfall Lodge was small, sterile, and hummed with the steady pulse of a Terran autodoc. Elias lay on the bunk, his leg encased in a high-tech regenerative cast. He looked older than he had 24 hours ago, the lines of his face etched deep by the trauma of the mountain. Vela sat by the window, watching the snow settle on the pines. She was wearing a simple gray tunic, her skin still pale and bruised. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of the night before. You're a hard case, Vela, Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Most people would have folded on that ridge. You didn't. You embraced the grind. I did what I had to do, she replied, not looking at him. Is that what being human feels like? Always being one mistake away from the dark? Something like that, Elias said. We don't have the light pools of Xylos. We just have each other and a lot of stubbornness. It's a messy way to live, but it gets the job done. A sharp, rhythmic chirping interrupted them. It was the emergency beacon in Vela's pack, flashing a high-priority crimson. She hurried to the table and activated the holographic projector. The image that flickered to life wasn't her father. It was Captain Bourne, his face blood-streaked. The background behind him a chaotic blur of smoke and flashing alarms. Princess, the transmission is compromised, Bourne shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the sound of explosions. The Vorkul have breached the outer rim. They've deployed a new weapon, a biophotonic dampener. It's targeting our high-yield warriors. Thorne, the Council. They're being harvested, Vela. Their light is their target. Vela felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. How? Our shields are designed to deflect photonic interference. They aren't deflecting this, Bourne said, coughing violently. The Vorkul have a sensor array that locks onto the brightest signatures. The more powerful the warrior, the easier they are to find. They're being picked off from orbit. The Kalim Spire is a beacon for them. Your father has retreated to the lower catacombs, but he can't hold out for long. The hologram flickered and died, replaced by a wall of static. Vela stared at the empty space where Vorn's face had been. Her breath was short, her mind racing. The very strength that Xylos worshipped, the brilliant, blinding power of their warriors, had become their greatest weakness. Elias sat up, ignoring the protest of his leg. Did you hear that? He asked, his eyes sharp. The brightest signatures. Vela looked down at her hands. Her skin was dim, the silver glow barely a whisper. My fragility, she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. I don't have a high-yield signature. Exactly, Elias said, leaning forward. On Gaea, we have stealth tech that works on the same principle. If you can't outpower the radar, you slip under it. You're not a beacon, Vela. You're a shadow. You're the only warrior in the hegemony who can move through that dampening field without being detected. It's the stealth frequency, Vela whispered. The Vorkul sensors won't see me. I can walk right through their front door. But you can't do it with a Xylos spear, Elias warned. You go in there with a light weapon, you're dead. You have to go in kinetic. You have to go in Gaean. Vela looked at the matte gray blade resting on the table, the short, ugly piece of tungsten carbide that she had once called a tool for a thief. She realized now why her father had sent her here. It wasn't just to make her stronger. It was because he had foreseen a war where raw power was a liability. He had sent her to learn how to be invisible. The humanistic theme of her journey reached its first true peak. Her flaw, the condition that had made her an outcast in her own home, was the key to her people's survival. But to use it, she had to fully accept that she would never be the radiant heir. She would have to be the ghost. I need to go home, she said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute certainty. You're not ready, Elias said, though his eyes betrayed his pride. You've still got 2 months of training left. You're fast, but you're still fragile. If they catch you, it's game over. There are no respawns in a real war, kid. Then I won't let them catch me, she said. I'll use the asymmetric flow. I'll use the magnetic tethers of the spire. I'll be the dust that dances. Elias reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, battered silver coin, the emblem of the Iron Hounds. He tossed it to her. She caught it with a blur of silver speed. Take that, he said. It's a reminder. When you're in the dark and you think you can't take another step, remember the ridge. Remember that the planet is only as heavy as you let it be. Vela closed her hand over the coin. Thank you, Elias, for everything. Don't get mushy on me now, Thorne grumbled, though his voice was thick. Just make sure you frag those Vorkul bastards. And Vela? Yes? Check your 6. Always. 3 hours later, a small unremarked courier ship lifted off from the hidden pad near the Crestfall Lodge. It carried no royal banners, no ceremonial guards, and no light arrays. It was a dark shape against the stars, moving with the quiet, predatory intent of a hunter. Inside, Vela sat in the adaptation chamber, feeling the gravity of Gaia slowly decrease as the ship moved into the void. Her body felt strangely light, almost too buoyant. She missed the weight. She missed the struggle. She looked at her reflection in the darkened viewport. She wasn't the girl who had arrived on Tri-Jot 98 days ago. Her silver skin was tougher, her eyes were harder, and her spirit was no longer flickering. It was a steady, cold flame. The Vorkul thought they had won. They thought they had extinguished the light of Xylos. They didn't realize that in the shadows, a different kind of fire had been forged, a fire that didn't need to blind to kill. As the ship accelerated toward the Kalem spire, Vela began to rehearse the forms Elias had taught her. The low strikes, the magnetic slides, the silent kills. She was the heir to the hegemony, but she was also a student of the mud. The cost of her journey was the loss of her innocence, but the prize was the survival of her race. She was no longer a princess in a crystal tower. She was an asymmetric blade, and she was coming home to cut. The transition to Xylos gravity would be easy, a relief for her strengthened muscles. But the transition to war would be the true test. She would have to face her cousin Torin, face the council that had mocked her, and face an invading army that outpowered her in every measurable way. She didn't care. She was Oscar Mike. And for the first time in 22 years, Vela felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the steady hum of the engines and the rhythmic ticking of the silver coin against the metal of her suit. One step, one breath, one kill. The ghost of Xylos was coming, and the galaxy would never be the same. The void of space around the Xylos hegemony was no longer a tapestry of shimmering starlight and crystalline trade routes. It was a graveyard of cold, dark husks. As the courier ship drifted toward the outer atmosphere of Kalem Prime, Vela looked through the viewport and felt a hollow ache in her chest. The great orbital rings, once pulsing with the rhythmic biophotonic energy of a billion souls, were fractured. Their light had been bled dry, leaving behind nothing but jagged metallic ribs that cast long, skeletal shadows over the planet below. Oxygen levels at 70%, the ship's computer chimed in its sterile, melodic tone. External pressure decreasing, gravity normalization complete. normalization. To the computer, it was a return to the standard Xylos pull of zero point 0.5 Gaea units. To Vela, it felt like she had suddenly turned into a ghost. Her muscles, forged in the crushing embrace of Gaea Secundus for nearly 100 days, felt terrifyingly powerful. She felt as though she might float away if she didn't grip the command chair. She was 22 years old and, for the first time in her life, she felt like a giant among her own kind. She adjusted the matte gray tungsten blade at her hip. It was heavy, a solid weight that anchored her to the reality of the training she had endured. On Gaia, this blade was a desperate tool. Here, in the light gravity of Xylos, it was an engine of kinetic destruction. "Keep your head on a swivel, kid," Elias's voice whispered in the back of her mind. "Don't get cocky just because you feel light. Speed is your edge, but momentum is a beast you have to steer." Vela activated the stealth shroud, a Terran modification Elias had installed during her final week. It didn't use light to hide the ship. It used a layer of absorbent carbon fiber and a heat sink that suppressed their thermal signature to near absolute zero. To the Vorkul sensor arrays, she was just another piece of space debris, a wandering rock in a sea of wreckage. She bypassed the main docking bays of the Kalem Spire, opting instead for a maintenance hatch located near the thermal exhaust ports. This was the dark underbelly of the city, a place of grease, coolant, and heavy machinery that the high-ranking nobility usually ignored. As the hatch hissed open, the air of Xylos rushed in. It smelled of ozone and dying lilies, the scent of a civilization on the brink of extinction. Vela stepped out onto the catwalk, her movements a blur of silent grace. She didn't use her internal light to see. She used a pair of Terran night vision goggles, viewing the world in a grainy, neon green spectrum. "Sit rep," she whispered into her comms, though there was no one on the other end to hear her. Location, Sector 39. Status, infiltrated. Threat level, extreme. She moved through the corridors like a shadow. She could feel the biophotonic dampener's effect now. It wasn't a physical weight, but a psychological one. A heavy, static-filled hum that made her skin crawl. It felt like a persistent itch at the base of her brain, trying to find a spark of photonic energy to latch onto. But Vela's light was dim, tucked away in the deep recesses of her strengthened cells. The dampener ignored her, its sensors searching for the brilliant bonfires of the Xylos Guardians. She turned a corner and froze. Two Vorkul scouts were standing guard over a pile of confiscated Xylos spears. They were monstrous creatures, nearly 3 meters tall, their exoskeletons a polished, oily black that seemed to absorb the dim light of the corridor. They didn't have eyes in the human sense. They had sensory pits that detected heat and photonic emissions. Vela didn't reach for her light. She didn't even draw her blade yet. She remembered the ghost walk. She felt the magnetic pull of the heavy coolant pipes running along the ceiling. She released her grip on the floor, allowing the magnetic tether to yank her upward. She moved through the air with zero sound, her silhouette a dark smudge against the overhead shadows. She landed behind the scouts, her feet making no more noise than a falling leaf. One scout turned, its mandibles clicking in a series of confused trills. It sensed something, a displacement of air perhaps, but it couldn't find a heat signature. Vela had practiced the cold breath technique for hours in the Gaia snow, slowing her heart rate and lowering her skin temperature until she was practically a statue. She drew the tungsten blade. In this gravity, the 50-centimeter piece of metal was a blur. She didn't strike for the head, she struck for the joints in the exoskeleton, the places where the alien's kinetic energy was most vulnerable. Slash, twist, pull. The first scout didn't even have time to hiss. The matte gray blade sheared through its primary nerve cluster with the clinical precision of a surgeon. It slumped to the ground, its dark ichor pooling on the floor. The second scout roared, a wet, grinding sound, and raised its heavy shock mace. Vela didn't retreat. She used the momentum of the first kill to pivot, her body a coiled spring of Gaian muscle. She stepped inside the scout's reach, the short blade rising in a brutal uppercut that pierced the creature's soft undermandible and buried itself deep in its brain. "KIA ×2, she whispered, her breath hitching. Her hands were shaking, not from fear but from the raw, concentrated power of her own body. She had just killed 2 elite Vorkul scouts in less than 5 seconds. Back on Gaia, that would have been a hard case encounter. Here it felt like she was fighting in slow motion. She didn't linger. She stripped the scouts of their communication beads and continued her ascent toward the royal chambers. As she reached the higher levels, the evidence of the slaughter became more pronounced. She passed the bodies of Xylos nobles. Their skin turned a dull, translucent gray, where the Vorkul dampener had literally sucked the life force from their cells. They had died trying to fight with light, their brilliant displays of power serving only as a homing beacon for their executioners. She found her cousin, Thorne, in the Hall of Valor. He was huddled behind a shattered quartz pillar, his ceremonial armor cracked, his once magnificent silver hair matted with grime. He was a pillar of the hegemony, the strongest warrior of his generation, and now he was a broken animal, shivering in the dark. "Vela?" he gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief as she stepped out of the shadows. "Is that you? Your light? It's gone. You look like a peasant." "Quiet, Thorne," she commanded, her voice sharp and devoid of royal fluff. "The Vorkul are patrolling the next tier. If you light up even a flicker, you're dead." Thorne looked at her, his gaze falling on the dark blood on her blade and the Terran gear she wore. "What happened to you?" he whispered. "You've become ugly." "I've become a survivor," she countered, grabbing him by the shoulder and hauling him upright. "Your light is a target, Thorne. That's the lesson the Council forgot. The strongest are the first to be harvested because they refuse to hide." "I can't fight them, Vela," he sobbed, his hands clutching his chest. "The dampener, it's like a vacuum. Every time I try to summon the light, it burns me. I'm empty." "Then stop trying to be a sun and start being a shadow," she snapped. She felt a surge of pity for him, but it was tempered by the hard-won pragmatism Elias had instilled in her. Thorne was a product of a system that equated brilliance with worth. Without his light, he felt like nothing. He couldn't accept that his perfection was his prison. "Sitrep," she thought, looking at the tactical layout of the spire. "The Vorkul have the command center. My father is in the lower catacombs with the survivors. To save them, I have to take out the dampener." "Where is the array?" she asked Thorne, shaking him. "The biophotonic dampener. Where did they ground it?" "The apex," Thorne stammered. "They've integrated it into the Radiant Spire's primary emitter. It's feeding on the planet's core light. The apex, the highest point in the city, the most exposed, most defended location on Xylos. Stay here," she told him, handing him a small Terran smoke grenade. "If they find you, pull the pin and bug out toward the maintenance shafts. Don't fight them, just run." "You're going to the apex?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You'll be killed. You don't even have a spear." "I don't need a spear," she said, her eyes narrowing. "I have the weight of the world on my side." She turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving the perfect air of Xylos shivering in the ruins of his own glory. As she climbed, she felt the humanistic theme Elias had talked about, the idea that being shattered or broken wasn't a defect, but a transformation. She was no longer trying to be the princess the Council wanted. She was the ghost Thorne had forged, and in the dark, silent corridors of Kalim Spire, the ghost was beginning to hunt. The climb to the apex was a grueling odyssey of vertical shadows. Vela bypassed the main elevators, which were now glowing with the sickly green light of Vorkul occupation. Instead, she used the external cooling ribs of the spire, clinging to the crystalline structures with her bare hands, her Gaean-strengthened fingers digging into crevices that would have been invisible to any other Xylos warrior. The wind at this altitude was fierce, a screaming gale that tried to peel her off the spire and hurl her into the abyssal depths of the city below. But the wind felt familiar. It felt like the storms of Gaea Secundus. It felt like home. She reached the summit, a wide circular platform where the Radiant Spire's primary emitter once channeled the lifeblood of the planet into the orbital rings. Now it was a blackened, distorted mess. A Vorkul construct, a pulsating heart of obsidian and dark energy, had been fused onto the emitter. It was the dampener. 4 elite Vorkul Praetorians stood guard. These were the hard cases, the absolute best the invading army had to offer. They were 4 meters tall, encased in bioorganic armor that rippled like liquid metal. They carried heavy kinetic energy cannons that could level a building. Vela crouched behind a ventilation unit, her heart rate steady, her mind a cold, calculating machine. Sit rep. 4 targets. Armor, heavy. Range, 50 meters. Outcome if detected, total FUBAR. She looked at the dampener. It was tethered to the spire by a series of high-tension photonic cables. These cables weren't carrying light. They were sucking it out of the planet. I can't fight 4 of them, she realized. Not even with the ghost walk. I need a fulcrum. She scanned the platform. Beside the dampener stood a massive maintenance crane, a relic from the spire's construction that had been repurposed to hold the alien construct in place. It was anchored by a series of magnetic clamps. She remembered the ridge on Gaea, the gravity drop, the leverage of the pack. I don't have to beat them, she whispered. I just have to move the world. She adjusted her belt, checking her supplies. She had 3 kinetic burst charges she'd borrowed from Elias's workshop and her tungsten blade. She looked at the magnetic clamps holding the crane. If she could blow the primary clamp, the entire structure, including the dampener, would be unsupported on the windward side. The wind, the screaming, Gaian-level wind of the spire's peak. It was her ally. She began the ghost walk, moving not across the floor, but along the underside of the platform's perimeter. She was upside down, her feet held in place by the magnetic boots Elias had insisted she wear. The Vorkul Praetorians scanned the platform above her, their heat pits searching for the slightest shimmer of life. They didn't think to look under their own feet. She reached the primary anchor of the crane. The metal was cold and groaned under the strain of the alien construct. She set the kinetic charges with steady hands, her fingers moving with the precision of a clockmaker. 5 minutes, she set the timer. She began her retreat, but as she moved, her boot brushed against a loose piece of quartz. The sound was microscopic, a tiny click in the roar of the wind. But to a Vorkul Praetorian, it was a thunderclap. The alien guard spun, its energy cannon whining as it powered up. It didn't fire immediately. It was confused. It sensed a physical presence but no light. It moved to the edge of the platform and peered over. Vela froze. She was hanging 10 meters below the creature, her silver skin blending into the gray shadows of the spire. She held her breath. Her cold breath technique pushed to its limit. Her internal light was a microscopic ember, buried under layers of iron and will. The Praetorian hissed, its mandibles clicking. It was centimeters away from her. She could smell its sulfurous breath. Then the comms bead she'd stolen from the scouts chirped. A burst of alien static filled the air. The guard barked a command to its comrades and turned away, its attention diverted by the report of a breach in the lower levels. The smoke grenade she had given Thorne. Thank you, cousin, she thought, a grim smile touching her lips. She scrambled back onto the platform, staying low, moving with the jagged, unpredictable speed of the asymmetric flow. She reached the far side of the emitter just as the timer hit 0. The explosion wasn't a bright flash of light. It was a dull, heavy thump of kinetic force. The magnetic clamp shattered, and the maintenance crane groaned as it began to list. The Vorkul Praetorians roared, their cannons firing blindly into the air. They tried to stabilize the construct, but they were warriors, not engineers. They didn't understand the physics of the spire. Vela stood up. She didn't hide anymore. She stood in the center of the platform, her matte gray blade drawn, her silver skin pulsing with a steady, defiant glow. It wasn't the blinding radiance of the Xylos Guardians. It was a cold, hard light, the light of a star that refused to go out. "Over here, you bastards," she screamed. She wasn't being a hero. She was being a distraction. 2 of the Praetorians turned and lunged toward her, their massive frames shaking the platform. Vela didn't meet them. She waited until the very last millisecond, then executed a magnetic slide. She didn't jump. She released her gravity boots and let the centrifugal force of the listing crane yank her across the platform. She blurred past the aliens, her blade catching one in the sensory pit. The creature screeched, its green ichor spraying the crystalline floor. The crane gave way. With a sound like the world breaking in half, the massive arm of the crane snapped. The dampener, no longer anchored, was caught by the 100-kilometer-an-hour wind. It swung out over the abyss, its photonic cables snapping one by one like fiery whips. The dark hum in the air vanished. For a second, there was a profound, terrifying silence. Then a pulse of pure, white light erupted from the planet's core, surging up through the spire. It was the lifeblood of Xylos, returning to its rightful home. Vela was thrown back by the shockwave, her body slamming into a support pillar. The world was suddenly too bright, too loud. The biophotonic energy was rushing back into the city, relighting the spires, reigniting the souls of her people. She saw the Vorkul Praetorians stumble, their sensors overwhelmed by the sudden influx of light. They were blinded by the very energy they had tried to harvest. Vela pushed herself up, her ribs screaming in protest. She looked at the Praetorian she had wounded. It was flailing, its energy cannon firing wildly into the sky. She stepped forward, her tungsten blade heavy in her hand. She didn't use a light strike. She used the weight of her own body, her Gaian-forged strength, to deliver a single crushing blow that severed the creature's head. "One," she whispered. She turned to the others. They were recovering, their bio-armor shifting to compensate for the light. They were still stronger than her. They were still faster. But they were fighting on Xylos, and she was fighting on the world she had made for herself. The climax of the battle was a symphony of kinetic motion. Vela used the returning light as a weapon, not by channeling it, but by positioning herself so the aliens were always looking into the suns. She used the listing platform as a slide, the magnetic tethers as bungees, and the short blade as a needle. She was the ghost. She was the dust. She was the fulcrum. By the time the last Praetorian fell over the edge of the spire, its exoskeleton shattered by a dozen precise strikes, Vela was the only thing left standing on the apex. She collapsed onto the crystalline floor, the cold wind whipping her silver hair. Her internal light was dim once more, exhausted by the effort. She looked at her hands, bruised, blood-stained, and trembling. "I did it," she wheezed. "Elias, I did it." The spire below her was beginning to sing. The people of Xylos were waking up. The Vorkul occupation was about to face 1,000,000,000 angry warriors who had just found their light again. But as the cheers began to echo up from the lower levels, Vela didn't feel like a queen. She didn't even feel like a hero. She felt like the girl in the mud of the Crestfall Valley, the one who had learned that strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you build, one agonizing centimeter at a time. Her transformation was painful. Her body was a map of scars, and her spirit was weathered by the cold. But as she looked out over the glowing city of Xylos, she realized that she was finally whole. She wasn't the shattered Vela anymore. She was the woman who had used her own fragility to save a world. The humanistic theme had moved from the mud of Gaia to the stars of Xylos. The lesson was clear. Perfection is a target, but flaws are a tool. And in the heart of the radiant spire, the weak daughter of Thalos had become the strongest pillar of them all. She closed her eyes, letting the light of her home world warm her tired skin. She was Oscar Mike. She was moving. And for the first time in 22 years, she knew exactly who she was. The scream of the biophotonic dampener's destruction was not a sound, but a psychic erasure. When the obsidian construct shattered atop the apex, the vacuum it had created in the local reality didn't just fill, it exploded. For 22 years, Vela had lived in a world where light was a commodity, a birthright, and a burden. Now, as the lifeblood of Xylos surged back into the crystalline veins of the Calum spire, it felt like being drowned in liquid diamonds. Vela lay on the vibrating floor of the platform, her fingers digging into the fissures of the quartz. The silver skin of her arms was no longer dim. It was white-hot, humming with a frequency that threatened to shake her atoms apart. Her genetic condition, the luminous fragility, acted like an undersized fuse in a high-voltage circuit. While the Vorkul Praetorians around her were literally bursting from the inside out, their bio-armor cooking in the sudden glare, Vela's low-capacity cells simply saturated and then went numb. "Sit rep," she gasped, the word tasting like ozone and metal. "Status is FUBAR." She forced herself to her knees. Her vision was a kaleidoscope of prismatic diffraction patterns, a chaotic mess of light bending through the atmospheric moisture. She looked toward the edge of the platform. The Vorkul fleet in high orbit was a scattered mess of dark shapes. Without the dampener to anchor their tactical grid, their ships were blind, reeling from the feedback loop. Below her, the city was waking up. The lights weren't the soft, orderly pulses of the old hegemony. They were jagged, erratic flares of defiance. Vela grabbed her matte gray tungsten blade. It felt heavier than ever, a piece of solid, unyielding Gaian reality in a world of flickering energy. She began her descent, but she didn't use the stairs. She didn't have the luxury of time. She looked at the magnetic cooling ribs of the spire, now glowing with a dangerous, violet intensity. "Elias, if you can hear me in the stars, hold my beer," she whispered, using a strange colloquial expression the old soldier had once mentioned during a particularly drunken evening. She released her grip and fell. It was a controlled drop of 300 meters. In Xylo's gravity, she was a feather, but she used her magnetic boots to steer, snapping herself from one rib to the next like a pinball. She was a silver ghost in the machinery of the Empire. Every time she hit a rib, her strengthened bones took the shock with a dull thud. On Gaea, this would have turned her to jelly. Here, it was just another rep. She reached the Hall of Valor. The smoke from the grenades she had given Thorne was still thick, but the light was returning, slicing through the gray haze like glowing sabers. She saw Thorne first. He was standing over a downed Vorkul scout, his ceremonial spear ignited with a blinding, uncontrolled flare. He looked terrified, a man holding a sun he didn't know how to extinguish. "Kill the light, Thorne!" Vela shouted, landing in a low crouch that sent a spiderweb of cracks through the floor. "You're overdrawing. You'll burn out your core." "Vela?" Thorne turned, his face illuminated by the terrifying brilliance of his own spear. "I can feel it. It's too much. The spire is screaming." "It's an overload," she said, moving toward him with the economical speed of the asymmetric flow. The dampener was holding back the core's pressure. "Now it's all coming back at once. You have to ground yourself." She grabbed the shaft of his spear, her tungsten blade acting as a lightning rod. She channeled the excess energy through her own body, letting it bleed out into the floor through her magnetic boots. Her skin sizzled, the smell of burning ozone filling her nostrils, but she didn't let go. She was the fulcrum. She was the fuse. Thorne's spear dimmed to a manageable glow. He slumped against a pillar, his breath coming in jagged sobs. "How did you—" "You shouldn't be able to touch that. Your cells are too weak." "They're not weak, Thorne," she said, her voice hard as the mountain granite. "They're just tuned to a different frequency. Now get it together. We've got a palace to clear." The next 3 hours were a blurred montage of kinetic violence and tactical coordination. Vela didn't lead like a Xylo's general. She didn't stand at the back and issue orders. She moved through the corridors as a shadow, clearing corners before the guards even realized the light was back. When she encountered pockets of Vorkul resistance, she didn't trade photonic blasts. She moved in close, using the short, matte gray blade to find the gaps in their armor. She was a ghost in the light. The aliens, their sensors already scrambled by the atmospheric surge, couldn't track her. She was too dim to be a target, too fast to be caught, and too heavy to be stopped. By the time she reached the royal catacombs, she was trailing a small army of survivors. They were a ragtag group, nobles in torn silks, engineers covered in grease, and warriors whose spears were flickering like dying candles. They followed her not because of her rank, but because she was the only thing in the city that seemed to have a direction. The doors to the catacombs were reinforced with heavy, zero-point field generators. Vela signaled for the group to halt. "Oscar Mike," she signaled to a group of combat engineers. "Get those fields down, quietly. I don't want a noisy breach." The engineers looked at her with a mix of awe and confusion. They were used to being told to maximize output. Now they were being told to be subtle. They worked with a newfound urgency, inspired by the girl who had walked through the fire without being consumed. The fields dropped. Vela was the first through the threshold. The inner sanctum was dim, illuminated by a few ancient, low-yield crystals. In the center of the room sat Archon Thalos. He looked old. The radiance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a gray, weathered endurance. He looked less like a god and more like Elias. "Father," Vela said, stepping into the center of the room. Thalos stood, his eyes searching the shadows. He saw the gray tactical suit, the scarred boots, and the matte gray blade. He saw the daughter he had sent away in a fit of desperate hope. "Vela," he whispered, You returned." The dampener is gone, she said, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. The Vorkul fleet is in retreat. The spire is ours again. Thalos walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her silver skin. It was cool to the touch, firm and muscular. He looked at the blade at her hip, then back at her eyes. You didn't return as the heir I expected, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. No, she replied. I returned as the warrior you needed. A secondary character, a high-ranking council member named Valerius who had survived the purge, stepped forward. He looked at Vela with a sneer that was rapidly being overtaken by a realization of his own irrelevance. You've compromised our traditions, princess, Valerius spat, though his voice lacked its usual venom. You fight with the tools of primitives. You've brought the dirt of Gaia into the Caelum Spire. Vela turned to him, her eyes flashing with a cold silver light. That dirt saved your life, Valerius. While you were hiding in the dark, waiting for someone to turn the lights back on, I was climbing the spire in a 100-kilometer-an-hour gale. If you want to talk about tradition, let's talk about the tradition of survival. Because right now, that's the only one that matters. The room went silent. The warriors behind Vela shifted their spears, a subtle but unmistakable sign of where their loyalty now lay. Thalos looked at the assembly, then at his daughter. The hegemony is broken, Vela. The old ways were a beacon, but they were also a target. We cannot go back to being what we were. I know, she said, her hand resting on the hilt of her tungsten blade. We're not going back. We're moving forward. And the first thing we're going to do is learn how to fight in the dark. As the immediate adrenaline of the battle began to fade, Vela felt the true weight of her journey. She looked at the scars on her hands and felt the dull ache in her strengthened bones. She had saved Xylos, but she had lost the princess she used to be. She was a hybrid now, a bridge between the brilliant arrogance of her birth and the gritty pragmatism of her training. She thought of Elias, sitting in his lodge on Gaia, probably complaining about the heater. He had taught her that fragility was just an unfinished strength. He had taught her that the world was heavy, but you only had to move it 1 centimeter at a time. Sit rep, she whispered to herself. Mission, accomplished. Status, changed. The reconstruction would take years. The Vorkul would return. The council would fight her every step of the way. But as Vela stood in the heart of the catacombs, surrounded by the ghosts of her past and the soldiers of her future, she knew that she was no longer a flickering candle. She was the fulcrum point of an empire, and the empire was finally beginning to turn. 6 months had passed since the night the light returned to Xylos, but the Caelum Spire was no longer the same city. The brilliant, blinding glare of the old era had been replaced by a more nuanced, controlled glow. The orbital rings were being repaired, but they were being fitted with Terran-inspired shielding, darker, heavier, and far more resilient. Vela stood before the mirror of Xylos, the massive crystalline wall that reflected the soul of the hegemony. She was 23 years old today. She was wearing a new set of ceremonial armor, designed by her own hand. It wasn't the traditional filigree of light-conductive quartz. It was a matte gray alloy, reinforced with kinetic dampening mesh. Over her heart, she wore a simple silver coin, the emblem of the Iron Hounds. Archon Thalos stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The council is waiting, Vela. They expect the coronation address. They expect you to claim the throne through the ancient rites. Vela looked at her reflection. She saw the scars on her neck from the ridge on Gaea. She saw the hard set of her jaw, and the way her silver skin now carried a subtle, permanent shimmer of stored kinetic energy. I'm not claiming the throne through the rites, Father, she said, her voice resonant and calm. I'm claiming it through the grind. She turned and walked out of the dressing chamber, her movements a fluid, silent glide. She didn't have a retinue of glowing attendants. She walked alone, the heavy tungsten blade at her hip clicking rhythmically against her armor. The coronation hall was packed. Every noble, every warrior, and every commoner who could fit into the spire was there. Even Valerius was present, sitting in the front row with an expression of forced neutrality. Vela stepped onto the central dais. She didn't wait for the ceremonial heralds. She didn't wait for the music. She simply raised her hand for silence. For 1,000 years we have worshipped the light, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, without the need for amplification. We believed that to be brilliant was to be strong. We believed that our fragility was a curse, a defect to be hidden or bred out. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. She saw Thorne, who was now leading the first unit of shadow strikers, warriors trained in the asymmetric arts. He nodded to her, a gesture of absolute respect. I was born with that curse, she continued. I was the heir who couldn't hold a spear. I was the shattered radiance. But on a world called Gaea, in a gravity that should have crushed me, I learned the truth. Light is a resource, but weight is a teacher. She reached down and drew the matte gray tungsten blade. The audience gasped. To draw a kinetic weapon during a coronation was an act of supreme heresy. This blade doesn't glow, Vela said, holding it up. It doesn't hum with power. It is heavy, it is cold, and it is honest. It doesn't care about your rank or your pedigree. It only cares about the force you put behind it. She slammed the blade into the crystalline floor. The sound was a deafening metallic crack that echoed like a gunshot. A spiderweb of fractures spread out from the point of impact, marring the perfect surface of the dais. The old hegemony is dead, she declared. It died when we refused to see the strength in our own shadows. I will not be your radiant queen. I will be your fulcrum. I will be the one who remembers that we are only as strong as our ability to endure the dark. The transformation was evident in every movement. She didn't sit on the floating quartz throne. She stood beside it, her hand resting on the hilt of the blade embedded in the floor. She had rejected the perfection of her station to embrace the reality of her struggle. As the ceremony concluded, not with a burst of light but with a somber collective vow of resilience, Vela walked to the balcony of the spire. She looked out over the city and, beyond it, toward the stars. She knew that Elias was out there, somewhere in the cold mountains of Gaea, probably calling her a hard case for actually going through with the coronation. She took a deep breath of the Xylos air, which now felt thin and light compared to the memory of the Gaian atmosphere. She felt a phantom weight on her shoulders, the weight of her people, her father's legacy, and the uncertain future. But she didn't buckle. She leaned into it. Reflection. Passage. I look back at that first day in the mud of the Crestfall Valley, and I barely recognized the girl who was shivering in the rain. She was so afraid of being broken, so terrified that her flaws made her less than human, less than Xylos. She thought strength was a destination, a place where the pain finally stops. But Elias showed me that the pain is the compass. Every bruise I earned on Gaea, every bone-deep ache from that crushing gravity, was a lesson in what I could actually withstand. We spend our lives trying to polish away the scratches, trying to hide the cracks in our armor, thinking they make us vulnerable. But in the dark of the spire, it wasn't my brilliance that saved us. It was the parts of me that had been hammered, the parts that were accustomed to the cold and the weight. I realize now that the most useful tools aren't the ones that stay perfect. They're the ones that have been broken and reforged until they have an edge that never dulls. Humanity, in all its messy, fragile stubbornness, gave me the one thing Xylos never could: the permission to be imperfect and the will to weaponize it. She stood there for a long time, the wind whipping her silver hair. The Empire was changing, she was changing, and the universe was a lot bigger and a lot heavier than she had ever imagined. She thought about the people who were still hiding their own shadows, still terrified of their own fragility. She thought about the weight they carried and the light they were trying to maintain. I spent years carrying my weakness like a lead jacket, thinking it was a prison, but it turned out to be the very thing that made me a ghost in the machine. I wonder, what is the one thing about yourself that you've always considered a flaw? The part of you that you've tried so hard to hide or fix? What if that very brokenness is actually the secret edge you need to survive the storm you're facing right now? Vela pulled the matte gray blade from the floor with a single, smooth motion. She didn't sheath it. She held it at her side, her thumb brushing the silver coin on her chest. The weight of the world was heavy, but she was ready to move it. The suns of Xylos set, and for the first time in history, the people of the spire didn't fear the coming of the night. They had a queen who knew the way through the dark.